Good morning. It is 5:15 in the morning and I couldn't sleep, so I decided to read more of the book to you. Welcome to my craft room. I'll give you a quick tour. Craft room. Look at all those craft supplies. That's my husband's workbench. That's the dollhouse trunk. Yeah. So it's a good setting to read. We read the first chapter of Orbiting Jupiter last time. And we left off with Joseph was kind of getting closer to Jack, but like really slowly. So they were walking to school instead of taking the bus, and the vice principal had told Jack that he maybe shouldn't hang around with Joseph so much because he wasn't a good influence. And Joseph was starting to milk the cows, and he was starting to open up a little bit to Jack about his daughter. Okay. Supper that night was warm and dark. Sometimes my mother likes to eat with only the candles lit, so we sat in the flickering yellow. Later, though, outside it was cold and bright. No moon, but the stars were so lit up, we didn't even need to turn the porch light on to stack splits for the kitchen wood stove. It only took a couple of trips for the three of us, and after we finished, I stopped in the yard and looked at the sky and said to my father, "Do you know which one is Jupiter?" "Jupiter?" he said. He looked at the stars. "Jack, I have no idea." He pointed. "Maybe that big one?" "Over there," Joseph said. He was pointing up above the mountains. "How do you know?" my father said. "I always know where Jupiter is," said Joseph. My father looked at him. It was the same sad look in his eyes. Joseph went inside. If only Mr. Canton had been there. If only he had, then he would have known that Jacob wasn't bad like he thought. Not all the teachers believed Joseph shouldn't be at Eastham Middle School. Coach Switek thought he was terrific. When we got to the apparatus unit in the middle of November, Coach found out that Joseph could do stuff better than any of the other 8th graders, better than any 8th grader he had ever coached before. Do a flip on the trampoline? Joseph could throw a double. Do a handstand on the parallel bars? Not a problem. And Joseph could balance on one hand for longer than you'd think. Vault over the pommel horse? Easy. Joseph added a twist. Really, a twist. Climbed the rope to the ceiling in under 60 seconds? Joseph climbed it in 38 without using his legs, which was the only thing Coach could show him how to do himself because Coach had lost both his legs to a landmine in Vietnam a long time ago. The first time they had raced to the ceiling and back, Coach Switek won by 4 seconds. The second time, Joseph beat him by 3. It was Joseph's third smile, sort of. "Don't crow," said Coach. "All you did was beat a legless old man by 2 seconds. 3, said Joseph, still smiling, sort of. 3, said Coach. Then he looked at the rest of the 8th graders and all the 7th and 6th graders too. "And that legless old man can still beat the rest of you by a whole lot more than 3 seconds, so let's get to work. And just so you know, I could do the rope in under 2 minutes, which hardly any other 6th grader could do. And so what if I had to use my legs? You're allowed." Mr. DeOnley was also glad that Joseph was at Eastham Middle. Mr. DeOnley taught 6th, 7th, and 8th grade math. He loved numbers and what they did and even how they looked, and sometimes he couldn't figure out why the rest of us didn't love them as much as he did, Sylvia. But I mean, who could love an equation except for Mr. Olney? On a day that Mr. DeOnley had bus monitor duty, I met Joseph at the end of the bus line and had to wait. Mr. DeOnley was asking Joseph questions. Geometry questions. Really, geometry questions. Joseph knew them all, I think, or he could figure them out. The next day, during 5th period office duty, Mr. DeOnley saw Joseph and me sitting on the office duty bench doing nothing, which is what most office duty periods were. So he scribbled a bunch of stuff on a pad and handed it to Joseph. "Can you prove this theorem?" he said. Joseph took the pad. He worked on it the whole period. When the bell rang, he took the pad to Mr. DeOnley's classroom. After that, Mr. DeOnley brought a new theorem to 5th period office duty every day. He would hand it to Joseph, and Joseph would get to work. Once Mr. Canton saw Mr. DeOnley handing over the new theorem, and he said, "These boys are on office duty." Mr. DeOnley turned to face him. "Of course," he said. "It's so much more important for them to run around the school dropping off messages than to be challenged to learn what great mathematicians have wrestled with for thousands of years." "You think that they would have solved these problems by now," said Mr. Canton. "It's not the solution, Mr. Canton. It's the path to the solution that's fascinating." said Mr. Dolney. He left, and Mr. Canton went into his office. He came out with 15 slips of paper folded over. "You need to deliver these," he said, "and when you get back, I want you to clean up the attendance files." After that day, we were pretty busy during office duty. So Joseph began to eat lunch in Mr. Dolney's room. Mr. Dolney said that maybe by the end of the school year he'd throw a little trigonometry at him. Those were the two teachers who liked Joseph. Joseph never talked about his family, but I met his father. Joseph wasn't home because he was at counseling. We were getting ready to milk the cows, and I was cleaning the stalls in the big barn when suddenly he was right next to me, standing by the manure traps. As soon as I saw him, I knew he was Joseph's father, same black eyes. "Joe around?" he said. The cows looked over, and their eyes got big, and their tails swished, and they started to hold their heads up and moo, which means they're pretty upset. Cows don't like strangers near the tie-up. They especially don't like strangers near the tie-up when they're about to be milked, unless they're the right kind of strangers, like Joseph was. "No," I said. "We got you doing chores, huh?" he said. "What are you here for?" Dahlia stamped her hind foot. When Dahlia stamps her hind foot, you know she's really upset. "I live here," I said. "I figured you live here. I mean, before." The milk pails clanged down behind me. It was my father. He was rubbing Dahlia's rump because she loves it as much as Rosie does. Almost as much as Rosie does. It always calms her down. "You Joseph's father?" he said. "That's right." My father nodded. "Jack," he said, "you come back over here and spread some more shavings for Rosie, would you?" Then he said to Joseph's father, "You're not supposed to be here." "Came to see what kind of hellhole they put my son into." "Like I said, you're not supposed to be here." "You have him shoveling manure, too. Is that what you get out of this, a bunch of kids who have to shovel manure for you?" My father took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "We're taking good care of Joseph," he said, "and now it's time for you to go. You know, I can—" "I'm sure you can, but like I said, now it's time for you to go." My father put his glasses back on, and they looked at each other for a while. Then Joseph's father said a few words I'm not allowed to say, and he looked at me. When my father took a step toward him, he said a few more words I'm not allowed to say, and then he left. Dahlia was watching the whole time. If Joseph's father had come within range, you know he would have limped out of the barn because of Dahlia's hoofs. Like I said, you can tell a whole lot about someone from the way the cows are around him. At the end of November, it looked like my father was right. We were in for a wicked winter. It snowed hard on Thanksgiving Day, maybe 9 or 10 inches, and then another couple of inches over the weekend. And it was cold. 15 on Thanksgiving Day, 10 on the Saturday after, and then up to 12 on Sunday. A regular heat wave, my father said. When it's that cold, you're glad to lean in to your warm cow in the morning. And Joseph did. After rubbing Rosie's rump and listening to her the way say that she loved him with her moos, he always milked her first now, morning and afternoon. Sometimes I wondered if he was still so slow just because she loved him and told him so, and Joseph didn't want to hurry any of that up. Maybe. It stayed cold that Monday, even though it was pretty bright out. There were snowflakes in the air that afternoon again, drifting like they didn't care if they landed. The bus passed us at Old First Congregational Church while we were heading home. Its windows were all fogged up, but I could hear Mr. Haskell yelling at John Wall over the diesel to close that window, close it right now, because John Wall had opened it to throw a snowball he'd smuggled on board. His throw, by the way, didn't even come close to us, probably because he didn't throw off his back foot the way Joseph taught me. The bus rolled through the high snow, and when it was gone, everything around us was only white. The ground, the trees, the clapboard of the church, the sky, even the Alliance, the river, was frozen white. Maybe that's why Joseph dropped his backpack on the road, clambered onto the high snow, and headed down to the river. I followed him. If you don't know the river, it's easy to miss where the bank ends and the river begins. And the Alliance flows pretty fast, so it doesn't wear safe ice until winter has hung around for a while, and it gets deep quicker than any river has a right to. I didn't think Joseph knew that river. The snow was thick, but Joseph was breaking a path through it, so it slowed him down more than me. Even so, he stepped onto the ice before I reached the bank. "Joseph, what are you doing?" "Figure it out, Jackie." He put his other foot on the ice. I thumped through the snow alongside. He shoved against his back foot and skidded along the ice, heading up the river. Me following up the bank. "You know," I said, "this is pretty new ice." He didn't answer. He shoved again, and that second time he didn't slide alongside the bank. He slid right out toward the middle of the river, where the ice was darker. "Joseph, I'm not kidding." It was like I wasn't even there. The wind came up hard, and Joseph unzipped his coat and held it out like wings, but it didn't push him along, so he shoved against his back foot again. The ice was slicker now, and he spun twice and shoved again, toward the dark center. Joseph! I think it must have sounded like I was crying or screaming. Maybe I was doing both, but however it sounded, Joseph looked at me. Then he turned back toward the dark ice, so I screamed the name I'd heard him say in the dark of night, the name I'd heard him say again and again. Maddie! Maddie! He turned towards me, and the way he looked at me, I didn't ever want anyone to look at me that way again. But he was so close to the dark ice. Maddie, I said. Shut up, he said. Shut up. I stood on the bank of the Alliance River in all that white and waited for Joseph to come back. But he did not move. He just did not move. On the road above us, a car drove past, another car and then another, but this one stopped, a voice crying out, Hey, you idiot kids, what are you doing down there? Get off the ice. Joseph looked up at the driver and then started to jump up and down, hard, pounding on the ice. The car drove away. Joseph stopped jumping. Suddenly, he looked like he was all tired out. Joseph, I said. He looked at me again, and he started to come back, one tired step after another. He wasn't sliding at all this time. Every step, the ice got wider. The winter I was 6, I saw a yellow dog on the thin ice on the Alliance. I was with my mother, and we were walking back from the breakfast potluck at the First Congregational Church before it became the old First Congregational Church. The yellow dog was out further onto the ice than Joseph, but not much, and it had fallen through, and its eyes were huge, and it was grabbing on with its front paws, scratching for something to hold on to. It wasn't making a sound. I told my mother we had to get it, but she held my arm so I wouldn't go down to the river. The other hand she held over her mouth. Once the dog almost got out, but the ice broke under it again, and it was scratching like anything. Then suddenly it stopped, put its head down on the ice, and slid into the dark water, and was gone. Gone. I live on a farm. I see animals die all the time. Never like that. I cried about that yellow dog every night for I don't know how long. I dreamed about that yellow dog. I dreamed about me being that yellow dog, and the cold water under the ice pulling my legs and dragging at me. And then my hands getting so cold they wouldn't work, and then the moment when I put my head down on the ice and slid into the dark water. I always woke up then, sweating, wondering if I had really screamed or not. That's what it felt like, a nightmare, when Joseph, maybe 3 steps away from the bank, fell through the ice of the Alliance River. He didn't go under. He spread out his arms and caught himself, but the water splashed up around him, and he went in, almost to his shoulders, and his eyes got huge, just like the yellow dog's. And you could almost see the current pulling his legs. And he started to reach for the shore, scratching the ice like the dog. I might have screamed. I took off my backpack and dumped everything out in the snow. Joseph was still scratching. I put one foot out onto the ice. He was only 3 steps away, and held onto the end of the strap of my backpack and tossed it to him. I felt my foot go through the ice and into the water, and onto some rocks. You couldn't believe how strong the current was under the ice, even just up to my knee. I might have screamed again, but Joseph grabbed one end of the backpack. Hold it, I hollered. He tried to pull himself onto the ice, but his left hand went through and he almost went under. I leaned toward the bank, pulling on the backpack. I felt my other foot slide down into the dark water, the current yanking at both my knees. I'm pretty sure I screamed then. Joseph tried to push himself up on the other side, and that ice held. I pulled to get in the backpack, and his chest came up above the ice. Back up, he hollered, back up. But I couldn't back up. The water was rushing, and if I took my feet away from the rocks beneath them, I didn't know what would happen. Maybe I'd slide under, like the yellow dog. Joseph's whole body was up on the ice now. He bellied up the bank and rolled over onto the snow. He reached and grabbed my coat, and he pulled, and I felt my feet leaving the rocks, and for a second I might have screamed again, and then my back was up onto the bank, and I was trying to kick, which isn't so easy when your legs have been in freezing water, you know. And then my heels were going into snow and not into water, and I stopped screaming. Are you crazy? I yelled. Joseph stood and shook his whole body, like a dog spraying water away, but he was still soaked. Already his hair was freezing into black strands. Are you crazy? I yelled again. Joseph wiped the water from his face. I stood too and picked up everything I'd dumped out of my backpack, which was now as soaked as Joseph was, and already freezing too. This is how people die, I said. They fall into the water and get dragged under the ice, or they make it out and freeze to death. We better get back to your house, Jackie. It's Jack, I said. Yeah, said Joseph. Why did you? We're out now, he said, and started up toward the road. But his lips were already turning kind of blue, and he walked like his pants were frozen, which they probably were. Mine were. So maybe it wasn't such a bad thing that when we got to the top, Mr. Canton was driving up. He looked at us through the windshield like we really were the most complete jerks he had ever seen. He stopped the car and rolled down the window. Get in the back seat, he said. And I got in, and Joseph picked up his backpack and got in, and he shut the door. Mr. Canton turned the heater on high. If someone hadn't called the school about 2 crazy kids out on the ice, I wouldn't have come here. He turned to look at Joseph. It wasn't too hard to figure out who it would be either. Then he looked at me, and I guess you know what he was saying without him saying it. Take off your coats, and your sweaters too. Mr. Canton drove us home. When we stopped, he told us that he'd be talking to us about this during 5th period office duty. Something for you to look forward to, he said. You can imagine what my mother did when we got inside. Stand in front of the wood stove, she said. Everything that's wet, off. Quickly, she said. She ran upstairs and brought back the red woolen blankets from the hall under the cedar chest, the scratchy ones. Underwear, too, she said. It's not like there's anything I haven't seen. She handed us the blankets. Put these around you and stand there. Joseph took the red woolen blanket and looked at it and then wrapped it tightly around himself. My mother fussed around the stove and poured 2 cups of hot chocolate. Drink this, she said. Is there any coffee left over from... said Joseph. You're too young, she said. Joseph drank the hot chocolate. When my father got back, you can imagine what he did, too. Mostly at me. Jack, what do I tell you every winter? Don't go out onto the ice until you say it's safe. And did I say it's safe? No, sir. No, I didn't. Quiet, Joseph. I'll talk to you in a minute. Of all the brainless, fool things to do for a boy who has lived near a river all his life, this is the most brainless, the most fool thing you could come up with. If for 1 minute I could... He came out onto the ice for me, said Joseph. My father turned his face slowly towards Joseph. That's what we'll be talking about, he said. I don't need to tell you the rest. It had a lot to do with thinking through things, making smart decisions, and not making dumb risks for no reason at all. And in fact, not making dumb risks, period. Taking dumb risks, period. I can't tell you what my father said to Joseph since he sent me to the kitchen to get going on homework. But when they were done, Joseph came and sat down next to me. He opened the Physical Science Today textbook and flipped through the pages. Sorry, Jackie. That's all, he said. I'm sorry, he said. Sorry, Jackie, he said. That's all. Jack, I said. He took out his calculator and got to work. That night, it was cold in our room, and I was still sort of chilled, so I got into bed and under the covers about as quickly as a human being can do it. But when Joseph was ready, he stood by my bed and leaned his arms against the upper bunk and looked down at me. Maybe it was because of the freezing water, but for the first time I could see his scar clearly. The white line dragged down from his right arm and then dragged along his whole side and into his sweatpants. It's a long scar. I wondered if it went all the way down his leg. Jackie, he said. Jack, I said. Don't worry about Canton. Your father's going to call him. You'll be all right. I wasn't worried. I know. I wasn't. I know. My stomach knotted a little because I had been worried. A whole lot worried. Joseph shifted onto his other foot. Probably the wood floor was pretty cold. And Jackie said, don't ever say Maddie again, okay? Her name is Madeline. No one ever calls her Maddie except me. Okay. So don't say it again. Okay, I said. Okay. He went across to the desk and turned the light off. It was freezing, but he stood at the window looking at the night sky, his hand up against the cold pane. Then finally he came over and climbed up onto his bunk. He lay without moving for a long while. Joseph? I said. After a while, he said, Yeah? Why did you go out onto the ice? After another while. Maddie liked to skate, he said. And then we both lay there without moving. End of chapter 2.